Glad to have you with us today. Excellent. Hello back there. Two. All right. Good morning, everyone. Hello. So glad you're here. Oh yeah, Darrell's here.
Yes.
Just Darrell is here.
Can't say a word.
Yeah. And she's got a bone to pick with us because she had a question last week that we didn't get to.
And I don't even remember the question now, but I have another question.
Yes.
How do you get more prison? Because people can join the church from Brazil and they're accepted.
Yes.
So when a member participates via live stream, how do they get credited for being present?
So it's eternal heavenly credit that you get for that because we don't have any. I guess we could create an online check-in.
You should.
That's a good idea. We could restore the old 6-point record system. Yeah. Absolutely. Wow. So before we get started on our lesson today, I was recommending to a couple of you. I just want to say this blanket because this will apply to a lot of you. If you're a history buff, get yourself over to the Angelica to see the movie They Shall Never Grow Old. Have you seen it?
And I stayed for the making of.
Yeah. At the end, so Peter Jackson, who did all the Lord of the Rings movies, which have like 4 endings and they're way too long. My family disowns me every time I say that. Has done this. He's a wonderful filmmaker. They had access to 100 hours of film from World War I. Now just let that sink in.
Oh, wow.
There exists 100 hours of film from World War I. And the BBC and some other folks had captured in the 60s 600 hours of audio of World War I veterans. Amazing. And the entire documentary is put together with the restored footage of that film, some of it colorized, and all of the audio is the testimony, the spoken word of those veterans. It is amazing. Stay afterward after the credits. They explain how it's done, and it's remarkable. So if you care anything about history, go see that movie. Allison and I saw it on Valentine's Day. What a lovely Valentine's. Let's go talk about war. There were 8 people in the theater.
Oh.
There were 6 people besides us. They Shall Never Grow Old. Yeah.
A lot of them don't grow up.
Well, they shall never grow old because they got killed
Right away.
by the millions, right? By the millions. Okay, welcome. Let's see. My public service announcement. Hopefully, y'all. I looked through the unclaimed church directories this week, and some of your names were still there, and I know that you walked by there to get here. Thank you, Norman. Please.
It wasn't there, Mark.
Pardon?
I got mine, but it wasn't there. I had to go to the church.
Yeah, well, you're a special case. Special case.
It's a really good directory.
Thank you. Y'all all look pretty good in it.
Yeah.
We didn't win the prize, though, did we? Everybody getting in it?
Oh, you know what? I forgot to go calculate that. I need to do that. You know what? I did have a contest. Wow, I forgot. Yeah, I need to go calculate that. Okay.
Before you leave.
Wow. One more thing to do, and that was months ago. I should have done that.
Well, Neil and I helped. We brought our dog.
Oh, good. Okay, so in our study, we are walking through the red letter parts of the Gospels, minus the parables, because we did those last year. And today I actually gave you some red letters.
I love the red letters.
It's easier to see, isn't it? Yeah. And this is a long passage.
Yeah.
Right? I thought it was going to fit on one page and it didn't, and anyhow, that's my mistake. This is such a long passage, we're not going to read it all today, like we normally do. And for our live stream folks, we're in John chapter 4, verse 5, beginning verse 5, going through 42. So it's in John chapter 4. It's the story of the woman at the well. I'm going to just highlight parts of this as you read on your own, so we can sort of get this under our belt faster. So what's happening in John's narrative is Jesus is journeying, and he comes to a Samaritan city. So just a reminder here that the Samaritans were despised by the Jews, and they're sort of half-blood related to each other, and there's bad blood between them, and all of that due to intermarriage, right? And Jesus is walking through Samaria, and he comes to this city called Sychar, and John tells us that this happens near the plot of ground that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. So here we are connecting the New Testament all the way back to the Old Testament, right? And it's an interesting thing. He says Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired by the journey, was sitting at the well. So just think about the power of everything that's happening in these first two sentences, where John is connecting us all the way back to Genesis and telling us a bit of Israel's history. And here's Jesus in this important geographical location. Now, those of you who've been to Israel know that Israel's not a large place. So it's more doable than we might imagine that you would wander into some historic place, right? It's like being in Connecticut, for example, right? You wander around Connecticut for a few hours and you're going to land in
another state.
Some sort of history, right? Unlike Texas, where you can drive for hours and hours and hours and not see anything, right?
And still be in Texas.
And still be in Texas. So Jesus is tired, sitting by the well, and John tells us it's about noon. Now remember, I mentioned this last week, this story comes on the heels of Nicodemus, who comes to Jesus by night. And so John is giving us a literary contrast here between the rich ruler coming to Jesus under cover of darkness and the woman who's had 5 husbands coming to him in broad daylight, right? There's a big contrast here. So the Samaritan woman comes to draw water. Now, so we're having a reading with commentary here. If you're like me, you've probably grown up hearing this story, read that this Samaritan woman was, let's say, morally loose. Right? Is that how you've heard this story told? Yeah. The fact of the matter is we don't know. We've implied, right? We don't know. The fact that she's going to have had multiple husbands, I mean, they all died.
Maybe she was just unlucky.
Maybe she was unlucky in love. I mean, it happens, right?
But she was living with someone who wasn't her husband.
But that's true. I mean, would you get married again after the 5th time? I mean, right? Makes you wonder, right? So it's very easy for us to cast aspersion on this woman as somehow being a woman of the night or a woman of ill repute, the town, whatever. But John doesn't tell us that. The speculation is that she's drawing water in the heat of the day because she was excluded by the rest of the community. But we don't really know that for sure either. Right? So let's cut her a little slack here because we don't know her story in this.
She might have murdered all 5 of her husbands.
She could have been a black widow, right? Right? Yeah.
But at least she isn't morally loose.
We don't know. Yeah. And yeah.
You miss me, right?
For those of you who are concerned about Jesus turning water into wine, now here Jesus says, "Give me a drink," right? But he means water in this case. And it's interesting. John tells us the disciples are not there. Jesus is by himself because they've all gone to the city to buy food. Now, one of the first things I thought of in reading this passage is that Jesus violates the Billy Graham rule. You know what the Billy Graham rule is?
Not be alone with a woman.
Yeah, Billy Graham would never be alone with a female, lest he be accused of something. And that's generally not practical, and it's also sexist. And that's a whole other thing. Jesus is here by himself, out in open, with this woman. And she says, how is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria? Because we don't share things, right? And so John has to give a little interpretation to his audience, which tells us John is not writing to a predominantly Jewish audience, because they would know this already, right? So the parenthesis is an important clue to us.
Jesus could have been flirting with a woman. If she had so many men before, Jesus could have been flirting.
Well, he could have, and this is something we don't know. Did Jesus intentionally sit by the well that day, or did he just happen to sit by the well that day, right? And, you know, the gospel writers have, it's said previously there are many other things Jesus did. I think it's John who says, many other things Jesus did that are not recorded here. And so this is like the best of the stories, right? And Jesus says to her, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. Now, I've got to wonder, did Jesus really speak in the third person about himself? Interesting. But he turns the thing around here. And the woman says, sir, you have no bucket, the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? So what we have here is a failure to communicate. Right? Jesus is talking about spiritual water, she's talking about physical water, and they're not jihading yet in their conversation here, which gives us a clue. Now, what John is trying to do in this that is also very interesting is he's picking up the water theme that has already begun in John's gospel and is moving forward. Can you think of some of the other water themes we've seen in John's gospel so far? Baptism.
Water to wine.
Turning water into wine. Yes. Chad?
Well, last week with Nicodemus was being birth of water.
Yeah.
Natural
You must be born of water and the spirits. Right? We talked about that. This is a big idea in John. The whole water element here with this. And now it gets turned in this new way where Jesus says that he is the living water. And what this means, the phrase living water, is a reference to moving water. So most of you who have had any experience with ponds or lakes or rivers, those of you who fish or study biology would know there's a significant difference between a stagnant body of water and a moving body of water, right? It's like now when you go to a coffee shop like me and you order a cold brew, do you want it still or fizzy? I don't like it fizzy. This is talking about literally water that moves, right? Not water that is stagnant here. When Jesus talks about living water, the words he's using talk about movement, about and the woman says, we're at this well, right? Where are you going to get this moving water from this well? And besides, you don't even have a bucket, right? You're here with the wrong equipment for this thing. And then she says, are you greater than our ancestor Jacob, who gave us the well? Now think about the passage of time here. Think about how many decades had passed since Jacob's time, and this is still called Jacob's well, right? And she's still adhering to Jacob as her ancestor. That's amazing, right? The whole connection to this. Are you greater than our ancestor Jacob, who gave us this wells, and with his sons and his flocks drank from it? Talk about a sense of history, right? And here she is, a Samaritan, an outcast from Jewish society, despised, not good enough, and she ties her own story to the same story as Judaism back through Jacob because they share this ancestry, right? Really interesting comparison. And Jesus then speaks to her and says, everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, but those who drink of the water I will give them will never be thirsty. The water I give will become in them a spring of water gushing up to eternal life. Now, would we like to sing the song?
Spring up, oh well, gush, 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 gush.
That's it. I knew you would have it. Right, that's where that comes from.
That was good.
Thank you.
Yeah. And so now she starts to get it, right? She says, "Sir, give me this water so that I may never be thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water." And she's still thinking about physical water, right? It's like she thinks she's going to get permanent eyebrows, right? Or she'll never have to put on makeup again, right? Like, give me this water so I'll never be thirsty again, right? That's what she's thinking. And Jesus, they're still not on the same plane of existence here with this, right? And so Jesus turns the tables and we might say tricks her a bit. This is probably not a good form of inquisition. I wouldn't recommend this. Go call your husband and come back, which is a pointed question to her, right? And she says, I have no husband. And Jesus says, you're right, for you've had 5 husbands, and the one you have now is not your husband. What you said is true. And the woman is like, oh my, you must be for real, right? So as I was thinking about this story yesterday, my yoga studio had a little party over Dream Cafe yesterday for those of us who are students there. And as you would imagine, only the extroverts and the single people came. Thank you for laughing. Right? In that, I met one of my fellow students who I see all the time that I really had not, I didn't even know her name. And fascinating person. We sat and had a really interesting conversation. She's a spiritual, she calls herself a spiritual counselor and advisor. Not in the sense of Christian necessarily.
Oh.
But we had a really interesting conversation, and she began to tell me about things that encounters she'd had with people and how she had foretold their future and all this, right? And really very interesting. And
What was your name, Mark?
None of us can afford her. Let's just put it that way. Okay. Lovely person, but as I sat there and I thought, man, this is what it feels like to think someone's reading your mind, right? Mm-hmm. And what does she know about me that I don't want her to know? Right?
Project anything to it? You could have projected something.
I could have.
Tested her.
Yeah, I know. I should have tried that, but I was sort of afraid, right? And I was thinking about that experience and how this woman, the Samaritan woman at the well, when someone starts telling you something they're not supposed to know about you, doesn't that would freak you out, right? Mm-hmm. Like, oh no, I'm exposed. But look at her response. She's not freaked out. Why is she not running away in terror? I think I might have, right?
I think prophets were more common then.
Okay.
Had them around, and it was not as uncommon as it is now.
That could be true. Other thoughts on this?
Well, do people run away because they're ashamed or embarrassed?
And I think she wasn't.
She wasn't.
We would say she was sort of in tune with herself, probably, right? And like, okay, what else can you do to me?
Kind of bold.
Bold. Yeah, definitely bold. So this is a strong female character in the New Testament narrative here, right? This is why we shouldn't discount her in this at all, I don't think. She is holding her own with Jesus.
But if you were face to face with Jesus, you would, and you realized it, like women who recognized him not at first after he rose from the dead than they did, there would be such recognition and nothing would surprise you. If you saw the Son of God and realized he was the Messiah, you would know he knew that. I mean, there would be no.
She clearly has some sense that she's met an important prophet,
Yes.
right?
Well, it may be the way that he interacts with her, that she may have felt safe and that he's kind and that he's, not feel threatened by his questions or his responses.
Yeah, Brad,
Is this in more than one gospel?
no,
Okay.
it's only here. Yeah, Ann?
Well, there's just a certain amount of kind of good-oogity boogity in life, All the religions were not logical.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think in our age, we've sanitized religion in such a way that, we've taken the mystery out too often. And that's a whole nother subject we could get off on, the need for believing in mystery. We're just way too intellectual about this and want to get it all explained away, and sometimes things can't be explained, and that's okay, right? Yes, Jim?
But then as soon as she realizes this and comes to realize, okay, you're a prophet, I got a beef with you. Our ancestors have always worshipped here, and yet y'all say we got to do it in Jerusalem. So it's almost like she's been waiting.
Yeah.
Hey,
She's well prepared and bold again,
Yeah.
right? This is a really bold move, right? She knows what she's talking about.
Or it's a deflection.
Or it's a deflection. Like, let's change the subject. Let's not talk about me anymore. Let's talk about you. Right? Ella?
Well, it seems, we need to remember that lots of people, even to this day, that recognize Jesus as an important prophet, but not as Messiah or Son of God. And among the Jews, and I would assume the Samaritans as well, since they worship the same God, from the time of Jesus itself until today, they acknowledge Jesus as a prophet.
Exactly. Excellent point. And so she's not there yet. This is not falling down and saying, my Lord and my God, like Peter, right? It's a different kind of thing. And I want to say something more about that in a moment. But before I forget, I want to say, look again at the contrast between Nicodemus in the previous story and her. They're both confused by what Jesus says. They can't get it at first because they're like saying the same words. They don't hear each other. But beyond that, Nicodemus is named in the story. The woman is not. That's interesting. He's a man of high status, a Pharisee who comes to Jesus in the dark to query him about his identity. She is an outsider Samaritan who has a chance encounter with Jesus in the middle of the day. So that's notable. And then, I'm jumping ahead a moment. Let me come back. We'll pick up the thread in a minute. But what is it that happens whenever she leaves Jesus after this encounter? She goes in verse...
Goes into the city and tells them, hey.
Yeah, she goes verse 29. Come and see a man who told me everything I've ever done. He cannot be the Messiah, can he? Right? So, that's a really interesting response, right? She goes and she begins to talk to people, and what she says to them out of this encounter is, come see a man who told me everything I've ever done. In what universe is that a good idea? Right? I mean, who among us would want to go say, oh, come meet somebody who's told me everything I've ever done or thought?
I would want to go see that person.
But would you go brag about it?
Probably not.
I don't know.
I mean,
It's impossible that in their language and vernacular of the day, that was her way of really emphasizing this, the nature of Jesus.
Well, I think
she
Mike,
wanted to get that point across.
yeah, well, it
This
gets
is not
across,
just
doesn't
somebody
it?
just happened to
This
walk
is
up
not
and-
your run-of-the-mill
No,
person
no.
here, Terry.
I'm kind of surprised people even listened to her because it seemed like she was shunned. And
Yeah.
then for her to come in and, everybody's stopping to listen to her, that just doesn't seem right
right to me.
Well, it's a spectacular message that she has, right? So that may be part of it.
Is she trying to authenticate him?
Yeah. Yes, yes. And you gotta wonder, it's so often with these encounters with Jesus that are recorded in the Gospels, is that really what Jesus wanted? Is that the kind of response he wanted? Or not? So often he says, tell no one this has happened, and then people go tell everything. Right? And that's a whole nother subject of study called the Messianic Secret. Yes, Carol Ann?
Well, I was gonna say, maybe they were curious because she had left her water bottle behind. They had to think it was unusual that she had gone to the well and she came back with no water. And, that something must have happened. Either she'd fallen and broken the bottle or, or someone had accosted her. And that was another thing. The only way that I would have gone to the well with a man in the middle of the day, and this is out hopefully, well, not hopefully, but probably out in the middle of nowhere, I wouldn't have gone close to a well unless he had a very reassuring presence.
Yeah. We don't know the full context of this. If you go back and think of the woman as somehow a sinner, which beyond the sense that we're all sinners, what's interesting about this story is in John's Gospel, there's no reference to the woman's supposed sin, whatever that might be, other than having multiple husbands. She never repents of anything in this story, and no forgiveness is given in this story. So it's not about that. This story is not here for that. It's here for another reason. And we've got to ask ourselves, what is that reason that this story is in here? What are your thoughts on that? Why does John spend this much space, which is a lot of space in a short gospel, telling us this story? Why does it matter?
Is it his first time that he actually says he's the Messiah? Because she says, a Messiah's coming, and then I forget how his sentence is like, who you're talking to is he, kind of thing.
I am he.
I am he. Is that his first in the John Gospel?
I believe it is.
Maybe that's what is the overall importance of that.
Yeah, I think Ellen.
I never thought about this before because we always focus on the woman and her sin. But,
Right.
But given what you've just said, I'd say it's right at the beginning of his ministry, he's showing he came to the outcast.
Yeah.
Clearly, I think John's helping us get that picture in here, right? And again, you got to get the contrast. Nicodemus, woman at the well. There's a reason. There's a literary reason John has put those two things together, back to back, to give us two sides of a coin, so to speak. Does that make sense? Other thoughts on why this story's here?
Well, kind of to expand on it, is it a foreshadowing that Jesus came for more than the Jews?
Oh, yeah. Because what he's done here is he's gone to the other side of the tracks, right? I mean, he intentionally has ventured into the place he shouldn't be. And not only that, he's engaging someone there, right? He's having this intentional conversation while the disciples are off finding food, nonetheless, right? Like, you can imagine them coming back and say, Jesus, can we not leave you alone for a minute? Look what you went and did. Right? Yeah. Okay.
I think the important part, though, is that whatever the woman was, the people believed her and went. She must have been real convincing when she went to those people. And if she had been a sinner, like we always think, no matter what, she must have been so convincing and believing so much that they followed her there. And then he stayed for 2 days and all the things.
Yeah. Yep.
And I think we know typically Jewish people would go to Jericho and across Jordan and come back into Galilee just to avoid.
Right, yeah, Jesus.
Apparently they're in straight.
Yeah, Jesus took the road less traveled. on this one. Absolutely.
Seems like also he's not worried about the reputation he might now have by speaking to a woman, by speaking to a Samaritan, by speaking
Yeah,
to...
no. And so often, I mean, it's like eating with tax collectors and sinners. Jesus is not concerned about that. Excellent point. Yeah. Okay. Moving on down. Verse 19. Sir, I see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worship on this mountain, but you say the place where people must worship. And by you, she means you and the Jewish teachers say that we've got to go to Jerusalem. And we don't want to go to Jerusalem, right? And then Jesus says to her, believe me, the hour is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming, and now here, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father seeks such as these to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. So what Jesus is doing here is cutting through this debate between true blood Jews and the Samaritans that's dividing them about where is the appropriate place to worship. And Jesus says, you're both wrong. It doesn't matter. Because what matters now is spirit, not place. And that's what so much of Jesus' teaching. I mean, this is like, if his disciples had been there and heard this. Now, by the way, someone wrote this down.
Yes. That's good. Somebody didn't talk to a woman.
Did Jesus recount this later to them? If they were off buying food, did they like walk in on the conversation? How do we know this story?
That's a good question.
Right? Because the way it's told, there's only two people there happening this. Now, there could be divine wisdom involved in that. I'm not going to deny that. Right?
When the group comes back, I mean, the group does come back. And, I mean, they could have just turned to them or to the lady and said, like, what were y'all talking about before this, you know?
Yeah. So think there are other comparisons on this. When Jesus is speaking to the Jewish authorities about the temple and says, if you recall, that story was recently in worship, I believe, one of our scriptures, destroy this temple in 3 days, I will rebuild it. Right, and they think he's talking about the physical temple, and he's talking about himself, right? And so one of the key ideas that Jesus is introducing through his ministry is moving from physical location to spiritual location. And that's really a huge shift in Judaism. Because in following God's way, they built a place.
But that's the only place that God intersects with man at that point in time. That little place is the only place.
And it's not because they were narrow-minded, it's what God told them to do. And now Jesus has come along and said, no, place doesn't matter anymore. You can see how they would be disoriented with this, right? Difficult, I think. Jesus, as you pointed out in verse 26, I am he, I am the one who's speaking to you. And then the disciples come back. Here's where they re-enter the story. And as indicated, they were astonished, John says, that he was speaking with a woman. But no one said, what do you want, or why are you speaking with her? They were probably too dumbstruck, right? Then the woman left with her water jar and went back to the city, and we talked about what she said to them there. And John presents her question as like a double negative. Rather than saying, I think he might be the Messiah, he cannot be the Messiah. Like, you don't really want to do that, do you? Right? It's that kind of thing.
It's the takeaway.
Yeah.
Oh, this isn't for you. Oh, maybe it is.
Yeah. It's an interesting expression. And again, Mike, back to the point. How does John know what she says back in the city? I mean, yeah, and?
Well, the thought strikes me that, let's say by the time John was writing his gospel, he knows that somewhere along the line Jesus made this point. it's been passed down, this was at some point a conversation. And the rest of it is a literary device to make the point.
Yeah, I mean, there's a part of me that thinks, well, maybe this got written up in the Sychar Sentinel Post the next day. But I think there's a reality that's very likely that this becomes one of those important stories that follows Jesus around and is told over and over and over again. Because if this woman's back to the village talking, that must have produced some response. So other people know this story, and remember that John's gospel was written decades later. There's been a lot of passage time, and he and others have been able to assimilate the different parts of the story and put it together in a way that gives us an overview vision that the people there at the time would not have had.
But they spent 2 days with them, so.
So there's more, there's definitely more to the story than what we see here. This is the summary of it, right? But it opens a conversation.
Mark,
Yes.
you said, how would John know what the people in the town said?
Yes.
But in verse 39 it says many Samaritans they believed. So it could be the same people who she witnessed to
Oh,
there.
yes, excellent point,
And
Lorraine.
because the story was the same and many people said it, that's where John got the
So many people believe, it says, and certainly that would continue the conversation. Along. I think that's an excellent point. This is, again, something that probably takes on a life of its own along the way. Other thoughts on that from anyone? Okay. They left the city and were on their way to him. Meanwhile, the disciples are urging him, Rabbi, eat something. Remember, they went to the 7-Eleven to get some food. And they're back with some taquitos and off the roller thing and a bag of chips, maybe. And Jesus says, I wonder if they brought him the big gulp. Yeah. But he'd been at the well. I have food to eat that you do not know about. So again, the disciples don't get it.
No.
So Jesus is still talking on the spiritual plane. Disciples are on the 7-Eleven plane here. Surely someone's brought him something else to eat. Right? And Jesus says, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to complete his work. Did I include this part of the passage?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Do you not say 4 months more, then comes the harvest? But I tell you, look around you and see how the fields are ripe for harvesting. The reaper is already receiving wages and is gathering fruit for eternal life, so that sower and reaper may rejoice together. For here the saying holds true, one sows and another reaps. I sent you to reap that for which you did not labor. Others have labored, and you have entered into their labor. So many Samaritans from that city believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me everything I've ever done, right? And then in verse 41, and many more believed because of his word. They said to the woman, it is no longer because of what you said that we believe, for we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this is truly the Savior of the world. So the big arc of this story from John is that this woman becomes the key to the city. Right? It's not just about her and her salvation. It's about her being the person who introduces Jesus to everyone else in the village. So what's unusual about that is several things. One, Jesus, as always, uses the least likely person to be the spokesperson, right? To be the agent of reconciliation. That should give us some hope, right? If Jesus can use the Samaritan woman, surely Jesus can use us as well.
Although if she had 5 husbands, she might be related to most of the people in the town.
She might be. That's true.
Came from the family.
I mean, just a thought.
It is possible. Yeah. So there's that. The other thing is that Jesus is upending convention, right? And we've talked about that. But he's doing it in such a compelling way that it leads other people to believe. While the disciples his advisors gathered around him were saying, don't do that, and he does that anyway, the result is really, really good, right? And we see out of this many people coming to faith. So I'd like you to think for a moment about the lesson of this story, the words that Jesus speaks, and how, if you go back to the water theme, the living water flows through this woman to other people and spreads, right? How is it that someone who is clearly not going to be citizen of the year, regardless of what her situation is, she's not Nicodemus. We have no evidence in the Nicodemus story that he goes and converts anyone. But she does. What's the difference here? And what do we learn from this story about her? Yes, Caroline?
Remember when he said, those that have been forgiven little, it doesn't matter as much to them, but those that have been forgiven much?
Yeah.
Maybe she was forgiven more than Nicodemus, and she wanted to go out and share it.
I think it's a great answer. Jim?
I think back on even the Old Testament, Rahab the harlot was the one who God used to save their people and to allow the walls to come down, help in that, just to save them and to help them out. Even though she was a harlot, God used her. And it's one of the few women that's ever, mentioned like that in the Old Testament. And then you also look at, for example, this morning, talking about woe and blessed are they in the sermon about how the really rich and the powerful oftentimes will be cast down, and they don't really accept Christ's love and Christ's commandments so much as those who are needy. Speaking in the Beatitudes. And so I guess the thought is that God so often reaches out and uses those who are outcast all over the years, and yet it seems like those who are so rich and well-to-do don't really seem to receive it.
Yeah, there's a great connection to the Beatitudes. And by the way, it's a connection back to the prophet Isaiah, who prophesies that every mountain will be made low, every valley will be exalted, the rough places plain. There's a great leveling out prophesied by Isaiah, and this is what we see happening with Jesus in the Beatitudes and here as well, right? Jesus uses the most unlikely people to spread his news. Now, here's an application I'd like you to think about for yourself. If you're like me, and I suspect you are, we're all alike in this certain way, it's very easy to beat yourself up pretty regularly over whatever you've done or what you've said, right? Maybe that's just unique to me, right? But I can go back and rehash previous days' events and be really mad at myself for some stupid thing I said or something I did that was not the best thing I should have done, right? And there's a way to drill down on that and just play it over and over and over until the reruns take over your life, right? And here's a woman who, whatever her story is, could have had the rerun tape going nonstop, right? And Jesus uses her to say there's something more. The water that's here can lift you out of that narrative and bring you into a new narrative. Norman?
I think that throughout the Bible, God or Jesus has used unusual examples, and this brings to mind that God did not come to save the saints, but us. And you have to understand that to get what we're talking about. That He came here to save all of us, not the saints.
So think about this water metaphor then, lifting us up, right? Jesus later in John's gospel is going to say something similar. I am the water of life. It's in the I am statements of Jesus. I am the bread of life. All of these things, and that's a parallel to what's happening here, where Jesus is talking about being living water that springs up out of here. Is there any encouragement in this for you? Is there any hope to be found for you in today's story from Jesus? And if so, what is it? Anyone want to testify?
I think just the fact that most of us, or I guess none of us in here, are Jewish, and that we are Gentiles, I think this should just make us so happy that Jesus came to the Gentiles as well. I mean, the Jews were the chosen people, and we were the second ones, but thank God he came for us too.
Yes. All right.
Well, it just makes me think of the verse, my grace is sufficient for you, my power is made perfect in your weakness. Just a reminder that it's okay that we're weak, and it's okay that we have deficiencies. Everyone does, but it's also God uses those things. That's why I think he came to those that were most broken, or often used those that are most broken, because the other people, like the other Samaritans, would see that and think, if he can fix her, then maybe he can.
Then he can fix me.
Yeah, he can fix anyone.
Right. Excellent point, Chad.
I think too, it's one thing that I look at is it's all of the questionable, the bad things in her life led her to that well. Because if all that bad stuff wouldn't have happened, she wouldn't have been there at noon. And so I just find hope in the things that I've gone through that are the really bad things, the stuff that I'm ashamed of. That's what led me to Christ, and so I just see hope in that it doesn't make me a horrible person that I have to keep repeating the tape over and over.
Yeah.
It's actually what led me to the grace of Christ.
That's beautiful.
The thing I keep thinking of is women in Jesus' time in the East.
Yeah.
Because I flew into Sri Lanka a year after the tsunami to join a CBF construction team. And as we drove down to the mission site, there was this line of young women in white that stretched a couple of miles carrying lotus blossoms going to the Buddhist temple. And our missionary told us that these were young widows and their lives were over because there was no place in Eastern society for a widow. She was used property. She belonged back to her parents or maybe to her in-laws. They could sell her or give her to whoever the old man was looking for someone to take care of his children or nurse him. So we can't imagine that woman's status as a woman 2,000 years ago. But what it says is she had the courage to go and tell. And so often we don't have the courage to speak out.
Yeah.
What will they think of me, or they don't believe me or respect me anyway? And look what happened because she spoke out.
So on one level, this is a story about Jesus. On a really greater level, this is a story about this woman and what she does on behalf of Jesus, right?
And she's not even named.
And she's not even named. I've got one last thing I want to say, and this is for Jim's benefit, to circle back to a conversation we had last week or week before about different types of baptism, right? Interesting thing about this story, remember, it sets up in verse 1 about, if you look at verse 1, it's about baptism, right? That sets the stage for this story. Some interesting, I did a little more research on this week. In Matthew, John the Baptist baptizes with water for repentance. In Mark and Luke's Gospels, John the Baptist proclaims a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. John's Gospel here presents John the Baptist as the first witness to Christ, and his baptism finds meaning in making Jesus known. Chapter 1, verse 31 in John says, I came baptizing with water for this reason, that he might be revealed to Israel. So John's story is that the baptism of John the Baptist, the water activity, is to reveal Jesus as the Messiah, which leads us along the way to the story of this woman at the well, whose great contribution is to reveal Jesus. She's not baptized in this story in the way that John's doing, and yet the water moves her in a different way as well, all toward the same purpose of revealing who Jesus is to the people along the way. That's a really important reason I think John includes this story for us. Again, the woman becomes a witness. John is a witness, the woman at the well is a witness, and this invites us in to be witnesses as well. Okay, thanks for joining us on live stream, folks, and we'll move now to our prayer concern time here today. We're so glad that you've joined us in Discovery class via live stream today, and we hope that you'll join us every Sunday when you're available. If it's possible for you to join us in person, we would love to meet you as well. We meet every Sunday morning, about 9:45, 9:50, in the parlor at Wilshire Baptist Church, 4316 Abrams Road here in Dallas. If you'd like to know more about Wilshire, visit our website at wilshirebc.org, or also check out our YouTube channel at Wilshire BC on YouTube.